Continuing on our discussion about networks, it's important to talk about, why do we have networks? What do networks give us, right? What's the benefit of having networks? I want to talk about some of the advantages of using computer networks. One of those is reduced costs. We can share resources and applications and so forth on our network. So all of this sharing of resources and sharing applications can reduce costs significantly. When I was a kid in high school, back in the mid '90s, I took a class where we learned how to use a program to draw, architectural drawings. And when we wanted to print out our drawings, we would have to save our drawings to a floppy disk, and then we would go to a different computer in the classroom, and we'd have to use that. You put this floppy disk in a different computer, and it would automatically print out your drawing because we only had two printers in the classroom. Not every single computer couldn't have their own printer. That would be very expensive. So it took a lot of time, right, to get to have to print your document. But today, if you took a class like that at Camden County College, and they offer classes like this, like an AutoCAD class or a drafting class, you could print your document to the printer in the middle of the room without having to move your file to another computer on a USB drive or something. In fact, you can do that in our classroom, right? We have just two printers in our classroom, and we all share them. Same with applications. We have thousands of computers at Camden County College, but at any given time, there's probably less than 100 people trying to use Microsoft Word. So Camden County College only pays for probably 100 licenses of Microsoft Word. But even though it's installed on thousands and thousands of computers throughout the campus, Microsoft allows them to do that because only so many people are going to use it at the same time. If we didn't have networks to facilitate that, then the college would have to buy thousands of licenses of Microsoft Word, which would be prohibitively expensive. It's much easier to manage information. We have that centralized management of information. We can use databases, which we'll learn about later in this course. We'll talk about how databases work. So that's certainly a big advantage, being able to manage our information. Communication is certainly important. I do meetings now online with my clients. I no longer have to get on an airplane and fly across the country every week to have meetings. I can use things like WebEx and GoToMeeting, which are these platforms that let us have face-to-face meetings on the internet. We can use email for instant communication. We can use things like social networking and so forth that we'll talk about later on. And then, of course, productivity. Computers have significantly increased productivity in certain areas. But there are also some disadvantages. And you'll see here I have productivity on both sides, under both advantages and disadvantages. And as we get better computing technology and productivity goes up, it also can cause productivity to go down, paradoxically. And there's been some studies about that topic, but we've seen that as we get more complex technology, sometimes productivity can also go down. And also, if you think about it, back when I had my first job my first real job back in the 90s, I worked for a newspaper. And if I came into the office and I picked up one of the newspapers on my way into my office, and my boss walked by and I had my feet up reading the newspaper, my boss would say, "What the heck are you doing reading the newspaper? You should be working," right? But today, it's a lot easier to read the news while you're working. You can open up a web browser and go to CNN.com and start browsing the news. And here's the thing, when your boss walks by your desk, if they don't see your screen, does it look any different from working? Not really, right? So there's that productivity piece. The other disadvantages are autonomy. We all kind of have access to the same resources, which is great, but those resources are also strictly controlled in many environments and companies that you might work for. So you don't have the freedom that you might have had otherwise. You lose a lot of privacy because networks are sharing all of this information. Some of you, give up that information freely, like on Facebook and with Instagram and Twitter and all those sorts of things. So those could also be a concern. Privacy is certainly a concern. And we're going to talk about privacy in this section of the course. In another unit, we're going to talk about privacy and security. And certainly security is another concern. We have viruses and malware, and people can steal our information because it's all stored digitally. There was a recent data leakage at Equifax, which has almost everyone's information. A lot of people got hacked from that incident. And we'll talk about things like that later on, but those are also disadvantages. This would be a good time to take a quick break and quickly pause the video. And on your worksheet, I ask you to list some of these advantages and disadvantages, and maybe have a short discussion in the classroom about these advantages and disadvantages. So let's switch gears a little bit again. We're going to go back to talking about networks again. I talked about what a local area network is, all the technologies we use inside our home for networks or in a business for networks. But let's go back to the internet as a whole, right? I started off this lecture talking about the internet and a little bit about how it works, but let's talk in a little bit more detail how that works. I'm going to give you a little bit more background on how that works. So first, every computer on the internet, all of those routers that we talked about on the internet, each one has to have some kind of an address, which is called an Internet Protocol address or an IP address. They're really just binary numbers, right? But usually you'll see them written like this. So for example, 173.194.204.138. That is an IP address for a certain company on the internet. And what I'd like you to do real quick is pause the video and open up a web browser and type that number into a web browser. Actually, what you want to do is type HTTP : 2 forward slashes. The forward slash is the one next to your shift key. It also has a question mark on it. So HTTP and then forward slash or 2 forward slashes and then 173.194.204.138. And you can do that while I'm talking here too. So go ahead and pause the video, go to that, and see if you can see what company that is. I'll give you a second to do that. So hopefully you found out who that is, that's Google, right? But when we go to Google, when we want to get to Google's website, we don't type 173.194.204.138. Just like on our cell phones, right? On our cell phones, when you want to call somebody who's a friend, you don't have to dial their phone number to get them, right? You go into the phone book on your phone to find them, and you go into your contacts list and you say, call Harry or call Sam or call Susan or whoever, right? We have something similar on the internet. It's called the domain name system or DNS. You can think of DNS, and again, your book talks about DNS as well, but you can think of DNS as the sort of phone book of the internet. This is how we figure out, this is how your web browser, when you type google.com, this is how it figures out how to get to google.com. When you type google.com, your web browser goes to a DNS server and it says, give me the IP address for google.com. And the DNS server comes back and says it's 173.194.204.138. And then your web browser goes to that IP address and, the page comes up. Simple, easy peasy, right? All of that happens without you even seeing it, right? This all happens under the hood. So you don't even see this happen, but that's an important part of the internet. You've probably seen top-level domains like .com, .org, .edu. So Google is google.com. Camden County College is camdencc.edu. You have .gov, .mil. So for example, .com is usually for commercial websites. .org is usually for nonprofit organizations, although not always. .net is for network infrastructure companies. .edu is now .com, .org, and .net are pretty flexible, whereas and what I mean by that is if I'm not a network infrastructure company, I can probably still get a .net address. Semantically, it wouldn't make sense to do that, but a lot of people do it anyway. Whereas .edu, you can only get a something.edu address if you are a school or some kind of institution of higher learning or research or something along those lines. Likewise, .gov is only available for United States government entities, and .mil will only ever be available for the United States military. So if you're the Chinese military, you can't have a .mil address, right? It's only the United States. It's reserved only for the United States. And if you think about it, the United States really invented the internet, so we get to keep those domains. So those are some top-level domains. On your worksheet, I'm going to ask you to fill in those top-level domains so you're familiar with what they are, and we'll talk about why they're important to know those later on, because there is a reason that it might be useful to know about those top-level domains. So when we look at a URL, so before I asked you to type http : / to get to google.com, right? That HTTP was the protocol. So when you're using the World Wide Web, the protocol is either going to be HTTP or HTTPS. The S is for secure. We'll talk more about that in about a week when we talk about security. And then you have the domain, which would be Google, for example. And then you have the top-level domain, which might be the .com. And then the path, which might be advanced search, for example, for Google. And then you can also additionally have a resource. You don't always have to type that in, but if you're looking for a specific resource on a website, you'll have to type in the resource after the next /. And sometimes you can even go a little bit deeper than that. But these are the basic parts of a URL, a Uniform Resource Locator. So your book talks about a URL and the different parts, but what I would like you to do is pause the video, and I'm going to ask you to fill in there the top level domains and what we know about those, and also the parts of a URL that you see here on the screen. So go ahead and pause the video, and then we'll come back and finish up. Okay, we're back, and the next topic I want to discuss is just a little bit about how we move all this data through the internet. I talked about how the internet is, all these interconnected computers, and there's all these different pathways to get data from one point to another. And what's interesting about that is if you have some data that you want to send over a network, right? So let's say we have two computers on our network. The data could take many different paths to get from one computer to another. So if I had 16 packets of data that I wanted to, that's usually what we call it, right? These little sections of data that our computer breaks up our information, these little packets of data and sends it over a network. It could take many different pathways. And one of the cool things about the internet is, as this data is taking all of these different pathways, if you look, number 5 just got lost. It went to who knows where. But when it gets to the other side, it's all kind of jumbled up. But there's a mechanism in the protocols that we use for the internet that can make sure that they're put back in the right order. It knows what's missing, so it can request that packet to get resent, and then it shifts that into the computer while it's receiving the next set of packets, and so forth and so on. So it gives us an amazingly reliable method of communicating information across this huge worldwide network without losing any information or losing a lot of information. It's amazingly resilient to a lot of problems we would have if we didn't have these protocols and these standards that allow this stuff to happen. So that's one thing that's kind of interesting about the internet. And your book talks about that just a little bit. But one thing I do want to mention is that the internet and the World Wide Web are not the same thing. And I talked about that in the beginning of this presentation. When we talk about the internet, we're talking about the infrastructure, like a highway, for example, is infrastructure. And that's how we get our data from one point to another. The World Wide Web is an application that we use within the internet. So that's more like a car on the highway. So that's the relationship between these two. And for example, when we talk about the World Wide Web, so this is an example of what HTML looks like. Your book has a little example as well. So in your web browser, if you had that code for an HTML web page, it would look like this in your web browser. There are other applications on the World Wide Web other than HTML and so forth. The other applications you might see are email, Telnet, Usenet, Voice over IP. I actually showed you Telnet when we talked about different user interfaces. I showed you a command line interface and menu-driven interfaces. That was accessing those through something called Telnet. Actually, I was using SSH, but it's almost the same. And when I showed you Star Wars in that Telnet session, that was using Telnet. They're not as widely used, though, right? So email is definitely widely used, but most of us access it through a web browser, through the World Wide Web. Voice over IP is certainly becoming more common, which also uses the internet, but it's not the World Wide Web, so they're very different. So the World Wide Web is just one of many different applications that we can use on the internet. All right, so as far as accessing the web, you would connect to the internet through an ISP, like we talked about earlier, through dial-up or cable or Fios. You would open up a web browser on your phone or on your PC or a tablet or whatever you have. There are lots of different browsers. Internet Explorer used to be one of the most common because it was in Windows, but now a lot of people use Chrome. You probably have Chrome on your Android device. You can also have it on an iPhone. Firefox is another example, or Safari. Opera is kind of an obscure little browser. Even Facebook has its own built-in browser. So take a moment on the worksheet and fill in some of the different web browsers that we might use. And we're back. If you need a little more time, go ahead and pause the video again. But we're back, so let's talk about using the World Wide Web. So one of the problems with the World Wide Web is, in the old days, I talked about how I worked for a newspaper when I was younger. Back in the 90s, I worked for a newspaper, one in the Philadelphia area that you may have heard of, called the Daily News. But in any event, when I was younger, I worked for a newspaper, and one of the cool things about newspapers is they have editors, they have professional writers, and if you want to publish information, you have to own a newspaper to be a publisher, right? And that costs a lot of money. Most of us can't just go out and buy a newspaper and start publishing things. But the web has changed all that. The web has changed the whole landscape of how we disseminate information publicly. Now anybody can publish information. Anybody can sit in their basement and start their own little newspaper on the web and start getting readers, right? You don't have to be a publisher anymore to do that. And it's really democratized the idea of disseminating information. So as far as using the web, it really has become critical that we evaluate the content that we see online. And this is probably redundant. Hopefully you've talked about this in an English class as well. But I'll kind of reiterate some of the things here that you can look for to evaluate content that you see on the World Wide Web. One of those is that you can look at who the author was, so who wrote something. So you would look at the author. That could tell you a lot about whether or not you can trust the material you're looking at. More importantly, is there an author, right? If somebody writes something and puts it on the web and doesn't take credit for it, maybe that's something that should be a red flag if there is no author. Do they reference their sources, right? If you write an English paper and you forget to put citations, you're going to get points off of your paper. Same thing on the web. We should be taking points off when we're looking at things on the web to make sure they're referencing their sources. Where did they get this information? So that's also very important. What is the affiliation of the author? Are they affiliated with a hard right or a hard left organization? Are they with a kind of a centrist organization? Do they have an axe to grind? Do they work for the company that they're reviewing or something like that, right? So we want to look at their affiliation. What is their objective? Are they trying to sell us something? Or are they trying to, give us balanced information? What exactly is their purpose? We want to question all of these things. We can look at the accuracy in their spelling, their grammar, their language usage, their syntax. Obviously, if you see spelling errors and grammar errors and things like that, that will tell you that there is probably no editor. It's probably not an organization that is placing a lot of importance on accuracy, right? If they're not even going to take the time to check their spelling, that might be an indication of the type of organization that produced that content. So again, something we can look at. How current is it? Is it old? Is it new? Right? We can look at that as well. And also, you want to think about who is the source. For example, we can't believe everything we see on Facebook. Wikipedia is kind of okay, because the thing that's nice about Wikipedia is that it has sources. So sometimes you can use Wikipedia as sort of a launching pad, and you can look at those sources to get more trusted information. And then, of course, you have things like the databases that are very trustworthy that you can access through the library at the college, like EBSCO, Host, Westlaw, Nexus, and so forth. So that's a little bit about evaluating content on the web. And finally, I'll just mention one more thing. I talked about top-level domains. That can also give you some insight as to whether you can trust stuff on the web. If it's .com, .org, or .net, anybody could buy those domains. But who can get .edu and .mil and .gov? If you're looking at a website that's .gov, it's probably pretty trustworthy because it's part of the U.S. government, right? It's sponsored by the U.S. government. If it's .mil, again, it's the military. So if you trust the military, you can trust that content. And of course, .edu has to be a college or a university, so it's probably trustworthy content for the most part. Although in some colleges, any student could create a website there as well. So you want to be careful about that, but certainly that would be an indication of trust. So in your worksheet, the last thing you're going to do is fill in some blanks on how you can evaluate content on the web. So go ahead and fill that in and think about that. That's something that you might find on the test. And that concludes this session. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.